Thank you for listening to Real Biblical Application. I know it's been a while since I've been on. We've been kind of sorting out some internet issues, and I've been very busy as well. Hopefully, we can get more consistent with posting videos, and I hope you're excited about some of the videos we have coming up. I don't want to disclose exactly what we have coming up, so I guess it's hard for you to be excited for it, but we do have some videos coming up, some videos planned that I think you guys will enjoy. Today, I wanted to just do a brief study from the book of Mark. We're going to be looking at Mark chapter 8, and we're going to be looking at verses 27 through 38. Now, so far in the Gospel of Mark, there has been a lot happening. There has been a lot of excitement building around the Messiah, around Jesus and his teachings. He's been performing many miracles. In Mark chapter 1, he's kind of showing his power over the demonic world, or the spiritual realm, we might say, whenever he casts out demons. He shows his power over infection and infectious disease whenever he cleanses a leper. In Mark chapter 2, he shows his power over, we might say, the nervous system whenever he heals a paralytic man who's been paralyzed since birth. In Mark chapter 3, we see that even the unclean spirits are professing that he is the Son of God. In Mark chapter 4, he calms a storm. And in that, of course, he's showing his power over weather and over storms, and he's able to just speak, and they immediately go quiet and obey his command. In Mark chapter 5, he shows his power over death, and he shows his ability to give life whenever he raises Jairus' daughter. In Mark chapter 6, he shows that he has power and an ability to change quantity whenever he feeds 5,000 people with just a few loaves and fishes. He also showed his power over gravity. If you're a flat earther, you might say he showed his power over density whenever he walks on the water. In Mark chapter 7, he heals a deaf man, showing his power to give life and to give function to senses that have been impaired. So this anticipation about the Messiah, this excitement about the Messiah, has been building not only in Judea and Galilee, but also in the hearts and minds of the disciples. Now, just prior to these verses that we're looking at, chronologically speaking, Jesus gives this sermon, and after his sermon, he loses many followers. Many stop believing in him. And so, who he is may be in question by these disciples. Despite all the things that he's done, all the miracles he's performed, all the various aspects of this world and otherwise that he's shown power and authority over, there may be some hesitation with the disciples. And they need to have a resolve, a confidence in who Jesus is, because the road ahead is not going to be an easy one. It's going to be difficult, and they're going to have to deal with times when people reject his teachings, when people start falsely accusing him of things. They need to have the resolve to stand by what their beliefs are about him being the Messiah. So in Mark chapter 27 through 30, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" So he's given this sermon. People have stopped following. And he's like, what are people saying about me? People might think I'm some kind of charlatan or something like that. What are people saying about me? Who do people say that I am? And the disciples, they responded and they told him, some people say that you are John the Baptist. And as crazy as that sounds, others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him. He said, "You are the Christ." In other words, you are the long-awaited Messiah. And he strictly charged, he being Christ, strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Now that's interesting as well, and we'll get to that in a second. But this is a very important question. Who is Jesus? And this is a question that you find various answers to, not only in Jesus' time, but also today. If you were to ask a Jewish person, he might say Jesus is a false teacher, or another Jew might say that he was a good, profound teacher or a prophet. If you were to ask a Muslim person, he would probably affirm something similar, that maybe he was a great teacher, rabbi, or prophet, or something of that sort. But of course, neither of these groups are going to affirm that he is the Christ, such as Peter did here. And so even today, you have some speculation where people are like, maybe he was this, or maybe he was that, maybe he's this. Even people who are not Christians, people who maybe consider themselves agnostic or maybe even atheist, still would say there are some profound teachings recorded in the life of Jesus that are good for us to live by in our society. So even they would maybe affirm that Jesus was at least a good teacher. So who do you say Jesus is? That's a good question. Continuing on in Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 32, and he began to teach them. So Jesus is now starting to teach them, yes, I am the Messiah. In Matthew, whenever Peter confesses who Jesus is, he says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but it was my Father who revealed this to you." And you see this kind of play on words where Jesus says, "You are Peter, you are the son of Jonah, and you are correct to say, I am the Christ. I am the Son of God. Your father is Jonah. My father is God." But anyways, continuing on. Mark 8, 31 through 32. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. I think at this point we need to try to put ourselves in the shoes of the disciples. The disciples are sitting here. They've seen all these wonderful things happen. They've seen people leave him. They still affirm you are the Son of God. But their perception of who the Messiah would be, who the Christ would be, is probably very different than what Jesus actually was going to do, what he was actually going to carry out as the Messiah. Their expectation was the Messiah would come and he would establish a physical kingdom. And with this physical kingdom, he was going to free the Jewish people from bondage, from their bondage and the rule of Rome, and then they would conquer the entire world through the Messiah. And this was kind of their pie in the sky. This was their expectation or their understanding of what Scriptures taught. Only some of that is true in the sense that Christ did come and he did establish that kingdom, and that kingdom is going to fill the earth until the whole earth is filled with the knowledge and glory of God. That is a true concept, but not in a physical way. It's not a physical kingdom with a physical king who's reigning on a physical throne here on this earth. Instead, we have a spiritual kingdom made up of Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female. And this kingdom, Christ is reigning over all, but he is reigning from heaven. And he is essentially, his rule and reign is from heaven. That's why it says that he has a throne in heaven, because that's where his rule and reign comes from. Not that he physically has a chair that he sits on. God didn't look down and say, you know what? The kings of the earth have these big chairs that they sit on, and they look pretty neat. I think I would like one up here. No, there's no actual throne that Christ is reigning from. Instead, a throne is just a picture of his authority, his power, and his reign. It also says that the earth is his footstool, but again, that doesn't mean the earth is actually shaped like a footstool. It just means that the earth is under him. It's under his rule and reign. Anyways, so this perception is a little bit different than what the Jews expect. Regardless, Jesus is fulfilling this concept of becoming a king. And the difference is how does he become king? Does he become king by establishing a earthly kingdom, taking over the powers that be, and he conquers the world by riding on a charger, on a horse, and having this great physical army that conquers Rome and conquers the surrounding nations? No, that's not the idea. The idea is that he was going to suffer and that he was going to die. And through his death, he was given glory and honor and a name that is above every other name, Philippians 2. He is highly exalted because of what he did through suffering and dying and becoming a lamb that was slain. Christ is now reigning as king through that action. So he's trying to explain that to his disciples. He says, the Son of Man has to suffer. He's going to suffer many things, maybe kind of hearkening back to Isaiah 53 here. He's going to be rejected by the priests and the scribes, and he's going to be killed. The disciples have to be thinking, this doesn't sound right. This doesn't sound correct. And then he says, but after 3 days, I'm going to rise again. And we might be scratching our heads and saying, why were they so surprised whenever he rose from the grave? Because it says here in verse 32 that Jesus, in explaining all these things, explained these things plainly to them. In fact, at least 3 times in the Gospels, Jesus pulls them aside, tells them, I must die, but I'm going to rise again. He even told his enemies that. He said, talked about the sign of Jonah and 3 days in the belly and so on and so forth. He teaches these things. He teaches these principles at least 3 times to the disciples and 1 time at least to those who would actually put him to death. But they still don't get it. But they at least get the part that he's going to die, because it says Peter in Mark 8:32, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Now, this might seem pretty crazy that Peter would pull Jesus aside and say, no, this is not going to happen. I'm not going to allow it to happen. He is rebuking Jesus for what he taught. Now, remember in Matthew 16, which is the same account of what's going on here in Mark chapter 8, he said, flesh and blood has not revealed this statement that you've made, that I am the Messiah, to you, but it is my Father in heaven. In other words, he is speaking the words that God would want him to say. He is saying the things that are in agreement with God, that he is the Christ, that he is the Son of God. But in Mark 8:33, after Peter rebukes him, Jesus responds and he says, get behind me, Satan. Now, just seconds before this, Jesus says, you are speaking for God. You are saying the things that God would want you to say. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And now you have him saying, Get behind me, Satan. In other words, you are not speaking for God whenever you're rebuking me here. Instead, you are speaking for the enemy. You are speaking for Satan. And how quickly that changes from 1 second he's speaking for God, the next second he is speaking for the enemy. And of course, Peter doesn't realize this is going on. And also, he's not possessed either. He's not being possessed by Satan to say these things. But instead, what Jesus is saying is, you are tempting me. Satan was tempting Christ to not have to go to the cross, but that Satan would give him the kingdoms of the earth, and that he wouldn't have to go through all that pain and suffering, and tempting Jesus. And we know that this was a temptation for Jesus, because whenever he was in Gethsemane, he said, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. In other words, I don't want to have to go through this, but nevertheless, not my will be done in this, your will. In other words, I will go through this. I will go through this pain, through this suffering, through this horrific death, if it's what you would have me to do. Your will be done. And whenever Peter says, I am not going to allow you to go through this suffering, through this pain, through this death, it is only tempting Christ all the more to not go through it. And so he says, get behind me, Satan. I do not want your temptations. I am going to do the will of my Father. So continuing on in Mark 8:33, he says, this is why you are speaking for Satan here. He says, for you are not setting your mind on things of God, but you are setting your mind on things of man. You see, Satan doesn't have to possess us to get us to say things that are in according to his desires. He just needs us to lose our focus. He needs us to lose our focus on where our citizenship is. We are citizens of heaven. We are under the rule and reign of Christ. And he just needs us to lose our focus of who our true king is and where our true alliances lie. That's all he needs us to do, is just speak from our flesh, speak from our desires instead of God's. In Isaiah 55, verses 8-9, it says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth. In other words, my reign overseas, it's the reign of the earth is subordinate to my reign. The heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. In verse 34 of Mark chapter 8, Jesus begins this kind of profound teaching. He says, and calling the crowd to him with his disciples. So I guess there was a crowd around, but he was kind of having a conversation with his disciples. I don't know how private this conversation was when Peter declares, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, and so on. I don't know if that was private or semi-private. Maybe it was just among a crowd and the crowd was just kind of talking. I don't know. But there is a crowd there. We see that. But he calls the crowd to him with his disciples, and he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So this is a pretty profound teaching. This idea of taking up the cross. He's just told his disciples, I am going to die. I am going to suffer. And he said these things plainly. We don't know how far in depth. I don't know if he talked about his method of death being a cross or not. But here he's saying, if anyone wants to be my disciple, if anyone wants to follow me, he or she is going to have to take up his cross also. This is a prerequisite for becoming a disciple of Christ. And we see this throughout his ministry. Uh, the rich man came to him and he said, "If you want to follow me, you must sell all your possessions and come follow me." And he wasn't willing to do that. In other words, you are going to have to deny your ambitions, your goals, what you want in this life in order to follow me. It doesn't mean that this rich man couldn't work a job and make money or anything like that. But obviously, this rich man had a problem where these riches would get in the way of his following of Christ. Uh, the riches would become a stumbling block to him. And so Christ says, you're going to have to remove these stumbling blocks. You're going to have to make me your sole focus in this life. Anything that takes away from your focus and takes away from your desires to follow me, they need to be removed. Whenever we take up a cross, it's all about dying to self, dying to my desires, dying to my wants, dying to the things that I want to accomplish. And we say, hey, I want to accomplish what Christ wants for me in this life. I want to submit myself wholly, not holy as in holy, 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 but holy with a W, to Christ in this life. I am going to deny self. That's what taking up the cross is all about, because Christ, whenever he died, it was all about submission to the Father and denying his wants, his desires, and submitting wholly to the Father. He denied himself whenever he took up his cross. And so he asks us to do the same. We put to death ourself. We put to death our nature, our desires. And as 1 Peter says, we partake in the divine nature. We become partakers in that divine nature. We partake in the nature of Christ, the nature of God, and set our minds on things above instead of things on this earth. This is the teaching that Jesus is trying to talk about. So this idea of taking up your cross is extremely important to the Christian's life. This is what conversion is all about. We often think of conversion as maybe a one-time occurrence, maybe at the point of baptism, or if you're of another understanding of salvation, you might say it's whenever you say the sinner's prayer or confess your faith in Christ or whatever. You think it's a single point in your life when you become a Christian. When conversion is something that happens over a course of time. You are being converted. You are being changed. That's what conversion is. It's a change. It can often be associated with repentance as well. Repentance is making a change in your life, turning your way. Now, I think there is a point of conversion in your life, a singular point, when you're baptized, or if you believe the sinner's prayer or whatever it may be. You may believe that that point might be the start of your conversion, at the point whenever you made that turn to go in a different direction, made the decision to change. But as far as conversion goes, it's never a complete change straight from the get-go. It's something that happens over the course of your life. You are continually being molded into Christ, into what he has for you to be, what his desire is for you to be. It's a continual process. Conversion is never complete, I guess is what I'm trying to say. If I were to put it more simply, is it's not a one-time act, but it's a continual process of being converted into the image of Christ. In verse 35, it says, "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it." So, in other words, our goal is not to preserve this life we have. It's all about giving up our life and giving it over to the gospel, giving it over to Christ. This idea is also spoken of by Paul. Example is Galatians 2 and verse 20. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. In other words, what he's saying is, I have put to death myself. And it is no longer I who live, but instead it's Christ who lives in me. I have conformed myself to Christ and continually conforming myself to Christ. And the life I now live in my flesh while I'm here on this earth, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and he gave himself for me. In other words, I am trying to imitate what he did for me. Continuing on, Mark 8, 36 through 37. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? And that's absolutely right. Christ is asking you to give up your life and follow him. Don't be the rich man who holds on to your ambitions, your goals, your earthly focus, your earthly ambitions, and in the process forget about the life that you have been called to live as a Christian in submission to Christ. Philippians 3, 7 through 8, Paul says, whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. In other words, this is the most important thing in my life. And then he says, for his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things, and I count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ. Everything else in this world, the riches, the possessions, the earthly ambitions, all these things, Paul was willing to give up in his life for the sake of Christ. Verse 38, for whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with his holy angels. This one probably would have hit the disciples right in the gut. Their expectation has been this conquering king, this ruling king, and they were the best friends of this ruling king. In fact, they were arguing about who would be the greatest within his kingdom. So they were excited about this. But now Jesus has said that your expectation is not correct. Instead, I'm going to suffer. I'm going to die. I'm going to be put to death by the ones that you look up to, the scribes and the Pharisees and the leaders of your people. They're going to put me to death. This is going to be shameful for me. And instead of you being the popular friends of this king, you are going to be probably largely looked at as outcasts and people to avoid and marked. And he's saying, knowing that this is what's going to happen, are you still willing to follow me? Are you still willing to continue forward? Are you still willing to take up your cross and deny what your expectations are and take on this new reality where I am going to be put to death and I'm going to die and I'm going to be mocked and you're going to have to go through that same ridicule in your life? Are you still willing to do that? Or are you going to be ashamed of me and you're going to deny me and you're not going to follow me? And if you do that, I'm going to be ashamed of you whenever I return. The road ahead is not the road you're expecting. There's going to be hardship. There's going to be pain. There's going to be times when you're chased out of town. There's going to be times when you're persecuted. And Jesus needs to make sure that these disciples are ready for that road. They're ready to take on that road and to do it unashamedly. I think that's a word. And they're going to continue to be faithful to him because they have denied themselves. They don't care about being ridiculed. They don't care about their reputation. They have crucified themselves, and they are submitting wholly to Christ. That's what Christ wants from them, and of course, that's what Christ wants from us.